Before we start, I want to quickly tell you where today's vocabulary comes from. I was watching a news report recently. I'll drop the link in the chat in case you're curious. And I noticed something interesting. The topic itself is a sensitive one, and people have strong opinions on both sides. It was about immigration enforcement, and as you probably know, people have very strong opinions on both sides. But what really caught my attention wasn't the politics, it was the language. The vocabulary was incredibly useful for professional life. Emergency language, formal verbs, and words that show up in serious workplace conversations. And there's another benefit here. This kind of vocabulary also helps you understand American news and American culture much more clearly, because language reflects how people think, react, and communicate under pressure. So I asked myself, can we extract the language skills without turning this into a political debate? And the answer is yes. And that's exactly what we're doing today. And the answer is yes. And that's exactly what we're doing today. Now let's get into the language itself. These are words you'll hear in American news and professional settings. And more importantly, words you'll actually use in real workplace conversation. This is vocabulary that stays useful long after the news story changes. Before we move on, let me quickly show you what you'll get out of today's lesson. By the end of this session, you'll be comfortable using 17 advanced vocabulary terms that show up in news English and professional conversations. We'll also talk about register. In other words, when language needs to sound formal and when it doesn't. That distinction is a big one in the workplace. You'll practice using this vocabulary in real workplace situations, not just in theory. And I'll point out some common cultural mistakes people make in American business settings so you know what to say, and just as importantly, what to avoid. So this isn't just vocabulary. It's about using English confidently and appropriately in real life. Now let's talk about emergency vocabulary. The kind of language you hear when time is critical and people don't have the luxury of being polite or detailed. In emergency situations, English becomes very direct. The goal is speed and clarity, not perfect grammar. Let's start with the first expression, watch out. When someone says watch out, they're warning you that danger is nearby. It could be physical danger, like a car or equipment, or something happening very quickly. There's no explanation, just a warning. The second one is cut it off. This means stop or disconnect something immediately. You'll hear this in workplaces, hospitals, factories, and offices. For example, cut off the power, cut off the gas, or cut off access. And the third term is ramming. This describes hitting something with force, usually suddenly and unintentionally. It's often used in news reports or emergency situations. The important thing to notice is that all three expressions are short, direct, and urgent. That's exactly how emergency English works. Now let's look at how these words actually show up in real situations. Let's start with watch out. In the workplace, someone might say, watch out for the wet floor near the break room. There's no long explanation, just enough information to keep people safe. Cut it off works a little differently depending on context. In a professional or technical setting, you might hear, IT will cut off network access if the breach continues. But while driving, you might say, that car cut me off on the highway. Same words on different situation, and ramming is often used in warehouses, construction sites, or accident reports. For example, the forklift accidentally rammed the storage rack. What matters here isn't just the word, it's the context. You may not use this vocabulary every day, but when you hear it, you need to understand it instantly. Now let's shift into power verbs, the kind of verbs you hear in meetings, reports, and serious workplace conversations. These verbs sound more formal than everyday English, and that's intentional. They help you sound clear, confident, and professional without being emotional or vague. Let's go through these one by one. The first verb is impede. When something impedes progress, it slows things down or makes them difficult. You'll often hear this in business updates or project discussions. For example, supply issues are impeding progress. The second verb is obstruct. This is stronger than impede. To obstruct means to block something completely. It suggests a serious problem, not just a delay. The third verb is apprehend. In professional or legal contexts, this means to catch or arrest someone. It's very formal, and you'll see it more in reports and official statements than in casual speech. Next is confront. To confront something means to face it directly, often when it's uncomfortable or difficult, like confronting an issue, a mistake, or a conflict at work. And finally, facing. This is commonly used when talking about challenges. You might hear phrases like the company is facing budget constraints or we're facing increased competition. The key thing to notice is that these verbs help you sound precise and professional, especially when discussing problems or challenges. These two verbs are often confused, so let's slow down here for a moment. Impede and obstruct both relate to blocking something, but the degree is very different. When you use impede, you're talking about partial blocking. Something still moves forward, but more slowly or with difficulty. For example, the software bug impeded our productivity by 30%. Work continued, but it wasn't smooth, or in everyday language, heavy traffic impeded my commute. You still arrived, just later than expected. Obstruct, on the other hand, is much stronger. To obstruct means to block something completely. Progress stops. Nothing gets through. That's why we say things like, the server crash completely obstructed all operations, or a fallen tree obstructed the entire road. There's no movement until the obstacle is removed. So when you're choosing between these two verbs, ask yourself one simple question. Did things slow down, or did they stop completely? That answer tells you which verb to use. In business communication, choosing the right verb helps you describe problems accurately, without exaggerating. Now let's look at the verb apprehend. This is a very formal verb, and you'll mostly see it in legal, security, or official contexts. When authorities apprehend someone, it means they catch and arrest that person, usually after some kind of investigation or security incident. For example, security apprehended the individual who bypassed the gate. Notice the tone here. This doesn't sound casual at all, and that's intentional. That brings us to an important register warning. Remember, register simply means the level of formality you choose based on the situation and who you're speaking to. Apprehend belongs to a very formal register. You'll see it in reports, official statements, or security contexts, not in everyday conversation. So in casual speech, you would normally say catch or arrest instead. That's why you wouldn't say something like, I apprehended my cat under the bed. The sentence isn't grammatically wrong, but the register is off. It sounds unnatural. Register is just a fancy word for how formal or casual your language sounds. The takeaway is this. Apprehend is about authority and formality. Use it in reports and official statements, not in everyday conversation. Now let's talk about the verb confront. To confront someone means to face a person or a problem directly, usually when the situation is uncomfortable or sensitive. In business settings, confrontation doesn't automatically mean conflict. It often means addressing an issue instead of avoiding it. For example, I need to confront my manager about the unfair workload, or HR helped me confront the harassment issue professionally. These examples show that confront can be appropriate, but there's an important cultural nuance here. In American business culture, the word confront can sometimes sound strong or emotionally charged. That's why professionals often choose softer alternatives, especially in emails or meetings. Instead of saying confront, you might say address the issue with, discuss concerns with, or bring up the matter with. These phrases communicate the same intention, but in a way that sounds more collaborative and less aggressive. This is another good example of how register and word choice affect how your message is received. Choosing the right wording helps you handle difficult conversations professionally without creating unnecessary tension. Now let's look at the verb facing. When we say facing, we mean dealing with a difficult situation, usually something ongoing, not a single moment. This word is extremely common in business English, especially in meetings, reports, and emails, because it sounds calm and professional. For example, our company is facing budget cuts this quarter. Notice how this sounds serious, but not emotional. It's factual. Another example. I'm facing a tight deadline on this project. This tells your manager or team that there is pressure without sounding dramatic or defensive. And finally, the team is facing unexpected technical challenges. This is very common language in American workplaces. It acknowledges a problem without blaming anyone. One helpful pattern to remember is the structure, facing plus a noun that describes the problem. For example, facing delays, facing resistance, facing budget constraints. This verb is polite, professional, and culturally safe, which makes it a great choice for workplace communication. Let's pause here for a moment because this phrase is extremely useful. When you hear on top of that, think of it as stacking information. It means in addition to, but with a very specific feeling. You're not just adding information, you're adding another problem, another issue, or another frustration. That's why you'll hear this phrase very often in news reports, business updates, and workplace conversations, especially when things are not going well. Let's look at the idea, not just the words. If I say, the project is behind schedule, that's one problem. But when I add, on top of that, 2 developers quit. Now I'm layering problems. I'm helping the listener understand the full situation. Notice something important here. We usually use on top of that after a complete sentence, and then we introduce another issue. It's very common in professional explanations, especially when you're explaining delays, giving bad news, justifying decisions, or reporting challenges. You can use it in casual situations too, like the coffee example, but in business English, it sounds clear, organized, and natural. Small tip, because it often introduces negative information. Be careful with your tone in emails. You want to explain, not complain. Now let's see how this shows up when we put everything together in real communication. Okay, this one is small, but very powerful. These 2 words look almost the same, and they're related, but they do different jobs in a sentence. Let's break it down simply. First, constant. Constant is an adjective. That means it describes a noun. So when you hear constant, ask yourself, what thing is being described? For example, the constant noise from construction is affecting productivity. The noise is the thing, and we're describing it as always happening. Or, I'm getting constant notifications from this app. Notifications are the noun. Constant tells us they never stop. So remember, constant status describes a thing. Now let's look at constantly. Constantly is an adverb. That means it describes an action, a verb. Here you're answering, how often does someone do something? For example, she constantly seeks feedback to improve. That's actually positive. It shows effort and growth. But listen to this one. He's constantly late to meetings. Same word, very different feeling. This is important. Constantly often carries emotion or judgment, especially in workplace conversations. So be careful with it, because depending on context, it can sound supportive or critical. Constantly tansekant describes an action, often with attitude. Quick rule you can remember, constant plus noun, constantly plus verb. If you get that right, you'll sound much more natural, especially in professional English. Now your turn. Write 1 sentence using constant and 1 using constantly and post them in the comments. I'll read a few and give feedback. Now, I want to show you something you'll hear all the time in meetings. So far, we've talked about impede as a verb, meaning to slow something down or make it difficult. But in professional English, especially in business and project management, we often use the noun form impediment. Impediments are simply things that get in the way of progress. In meetings, you'll hear phrases like, "What are the current impediments? Are there any impediments we need to address?" For example, in project management, we've identified 3 major impediments to the product launch. In career discussions, language barriers can be impediments for international professionals. And inefficiency or operations, not having the proper software is an impediment to efficiency. This word sounds very professional and neutral. You're not blaming anyone. You're identifying obstacles so they can be solved. So remember, impede tongue the action, verb, impediment tongue the problem, noun. This is the kind of word that makes you sound experienced, not just fluent. Now let's talk about a word you hear a lot in the news, rhetoric. Rhetoric simply means language used to persuade or influence people. That's why you often hear it in political coverage or opinion pieces. For example, reporters might say, "The politician used angry rhetoric to excite the crowd." So here's the important cultural note, and this really matters in American business English. In corporate or professional settings, the word rhetoric can sound negative. It often suggests manipulation, exaggeration, or emotional pressure. That means if you say something like, "We need to improve our rhetoric," it might not land the way you expect. Instead, Americans usually choose softer, more neutral alternatives, things like messaging strategy, communication approach, or talking points. Those phrases sound professional, collaborative, and intentional, not manipulative. So this is a great example of why register matters. The word rhetoric is perfectly normal in news and politics, but in business, word choice signals tone, intent, and credibility. Same idea, different register. This is exactly the kind of nuance that doesn't show up in dictionaries, but it shows up everywhere in real professional communication. Let's talk about a word that sounds friendly and harmless, but actually carries a lot of cultural meaning, the word folks. Folks is an informal, friendly way to say people. You'll hear it all the time in American workplaces, but only in the right situations. For example, in a team meeting, it's very natural to say, "Hi, folks, let's get started." Or in a casual internal email, "Hey, folks, quick reminder about tomorrow's deadline." That sounds warm, approachable, and collaborative, which is why people like using it. But here's the important rule. Folks is not appropriate in formal or high-stakes settings. You wouldn't use it in a board presentation, a client proposal, or a formal report. In those contexts, it can sound too casual or even slightly disrespectful. So this is another example of register and audience awareness. Same word, same meaning. But whether it works depends entirely on who you're talking to and the power relationship. Use folks with peers or people you manage, not with superiors, clients, or formal audiences. Have you heard this word used at work or used it yourself? Tell me in the comments where you've heard folks used correctly or incorrectly. This slide is extremely important, especially for international professionals working in the U.S. In American workplace culture, historical comparisons, especially to events or groups associated with mass violence or atrocities, are never acceptable in professional settings. You may hear these comparisons in the news or on social media, but that does not mean they are appropriate at work. For example, comparing an organization or policy to groups like the Gestapo is considered inflammatory and offensive, regardless of intent. In a professional environment, this kind of language signals poor judgment, escalates conflict, and can seriously damage your credibility. In some cases, it can even cost someone their job. The key idea here is this: critique the policy, not history, not people, and not atrocities. If something feels overly strict, there are professional ways to express that. You can say things like, "The policies feel overly restrictive," "The procedures seem excessive," or "I'm concerned about the enforcement approach." These statements communicate concern without attacking, and that's what professional communication is about: clarity, restraint, and credibility. This is one of those cultural rules that isn't written down, but it's absolutely enforced. When in doubt, choose neutral professional language. It always travels better. Let's talk about a phrase you'll hear a lot in the news and online: mainstream media. On the surface, it sounds neutral. It simply refers to large, well-known news organizations, major TV networks, and newspapers. But in real usage, this term is loaded. It's often used in political debates to imply bias, credibility issues, or distrust. That's why in professional and workplace settings, I recommend avoiding the phrase altogether. Instead, use more neutral language like major news outlets, established media organizations, or traditional news sources. These terms communicate information without signaling a political position. And here's an important workplace tip. Talking about where you get your news can quickly reveal political views, even when that's not your intention, and that can create unnecessary tension at work. So the smart move is to focus on facts, outcomes, and information, not news brands or sources. Now let's do a quick but very important phrasal verb review, because this one causes a lot of confusion. We're looking at the word cut, but notice how the meaning changes completely depending on the context. First, cut it off. This usually means to stop a supply or a service: power, internet, water, access. So when you hear "they'll cut off the electricity," that's not emotional, it's administrative. Next, cut it out. This one is personal and conversational. It means stop doing something annoying. It's direct, and depending on your tone, it can sound playful or very irritated. And finally, cut off in driving. This has nothing to do with power or services. It means someone suddenly moved in front of you in a dangerous way. Same word. Completely different meanings, and this is why context matters so much in English, especially in fast situations like work, emergencies, or everyday conversations. If you ever feel unsure, stop and ask yourself, is this about services, behavior, or movement? That question alone will usually give you the right meaning. Quick question for you. Which one have you heard the most? Cut it off, cut it out, or cut me off? Drop it in the comments. Before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of everything we covered today. You don't need to memorize these. This slide is here to help you recognize the patterns. On the left, you have emergency and fast reaction language, words you hear when things move quickly. In the middle, you have power verbs and business language, the kind of vocabulary that shows up in emails, meetings, and reports. And on the right, you have register and cultural awareness terms, words that are not wrong, but can be risky depending on the audience or situation. This is exactly how real English works. It's not just about meaning, it's about context, tone, and judgment. If you can recognize these terms when you hear them, you're already operating at an advanced level. I'll also be putting together a printable reference and extra examples for anyone who wants to review this later. I'll share the details below. Which of these words surprised you the most? Or which one do you hear most often at work? Register awareness summary, matching language to situation. Before we finish, I want you to notice something important. None of these words are wrong. What matters is where and how you use them. This is what we call register, the level of formality you choose based on your audience and situation. For example, folks sounds friendly and casual. Colleagues or team members sounds professional and neutral. Cut it out may be fine with friends, but at work, please stop or please refrain is safer. The idea stays the same. the language changes. Advanced English is not about big words. It's about making the right choice at the right moment. The same idea can be expressed casually or formally. Choose based on your audience. In the comments, tell me, which register do you struggle with more? Casual or professional? Common mistakes to avoid. Before we wrap up, let's talk about a few common mistakes I see even advanced English speakers make at work. These aren't grammar mistakes. These are judgment and register mistakes, and they matter. Small pause. First, using the word rhetoric in business meetings. In professional American settings, that word often sounds manipulative or political. Instead, say messaging or communication strategy. Next, using folks with executives. It sounds friendly, but it can sound too casual in hierarchical settings. Use team or colleagues instead. Another big one, historical comparisons when criticizing policies. Even if you mean it jokingly or casually, it can come across as offensive or extreme. Focus on the impact of the policy, not emotional comparisons. And finally, discussing news sources at work. This often reveals political views and creates unnecessary tension. In professional environments, it's usually best to keep those conversations private. Pause, then anchor it. Strong communication isn't about saying everything you think. It's about saying what helps you succeed. Comment prompt, simple and effective. In the comments, which one surprised you the most? Short, non-threatening, very clickable. Let's wrap up with the key takeaways from today's lesson. First, News English is a powerful source of professional vocabulary, especially the kind you'll hear in meetings, reports, and corporate communication. Second, register matters. The same idea can sound professional or inappropriate depending on how you phrase it and who you're speaking to. Third, remember that context determines which term to use. Words like rhetoric, folks, or mainstream media aren't wrong, but they carry cultural and professional weight. Finally, in business settings, avoid inflammatory or emotionally loaded language. Focus on clarity, professionalism, and intent. Master the language and stay neutral on politics. That's how you communicate with confidence in the real world. If you'd like a downloadable reference or practice worksheet, tell me in the comments. No pressure, no selling, just value.